This is Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. Well, hello, my friends out there in the ether. Welcome to another episode of Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. My name is Joel, hailing from Dallas, Texas. I have here with me my good buddy Trent. How you doing, my friend?
Solid. Really good. Primed, prepped, ready to roll and spread the good news.
The good news. Evangelion in the Greek.
That's right.
As we both learned.
Mm-hmm.
All right, today we're going to dive into something kind of mid-philosophical, mid-philosophy, about something that's not only like foundational to being human beings. This is just what we're all dealing with in terms of how our brains operate, but also I'm going to assert is at the root, maybe the heart of the issue in terms of us as a country not being able to talk to each other and especially not being able to listen to each other. So for me, social media is tantamount to this. It just shows that we are addicted to giving the loudest microphones, the loudest megaphones to some of the dumbest ideas. That's how I would describe social media. So Trent, I need you to comment on a phrase that is super popular right now. It's everywhere. Speak your truth. All right. So what do you think of this phrase? It's my truth.
Yeah, I might echo Christopher Hitchens, who would say to something like this, I reject the grammar of the phrase. I think that it's kind of a contradiction in terms, kind of an oxymoron, your truth. It's akin to starting a sentence with I feel like instead of I think that. How you feel and what's going on is relevant, is important. But if we're trying to arrive at the truth, we do so most effectively by thinking about it, right? By acting and behaving rationally. And so the thing is speaking your truth. If truth is anything, truth is objective. Okay. Truth is outside of ourselves. It impinges on us as human beings, but it transcends us. It is objective, not subjective. Truth may make us feel good. It may upset us. So however it works is irrespective of whether or not it's true. And I think that when people talk about my truth or speak your truth, what we're dealing with, all that language falls under the rubric of pragmatism. What works for human beings or for a human being? That's what that phraseology fits under. It's not really about the search for truth. It's how can I believe certain things so that my life can work out the way that I want to. And that's understandable, but I don't think that the search for truth, the discussion about truth, needs to center upon how people feel or what is relevant or right for them. Would you agree with that?
100%. Yeah, I do think that speak my truth. When I speak my truth, that's just another way of saying I think or I feel. There's a relativism in it. And when we try to relativize the truth, it gets confusing. Like I'm a fan of self-expression, so that's where I think like there's a benefit to speak your truth. I used to be part of this this program that worked with teenagers, and it was spoken word, and they would write their own poetry and they present it to people, and it was so beautiful because they were just sharing their perspective and how they felt from their point of view. And I think that's really healthy for people to find a way to express what they're experiencing. Beautiful. No problem with that. What I don't like is that we use the word truth in there and it muddies the water because my truth isn't the truth. And so what are we actually talking about here? To seek the truth means that you are not going to probably enjoy that experience because seeking the truth challenges your ego. And Richard Rohr says he's a Franciscan priest, and he says he quotes the line from the Gospels. The truth will set you free, but first it'll make you miserable.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And by the way, the one of the values of hearing different people's perspectives is if I have overweening confidence in my understanding of the world, the moments that I come into contact with people who see it differently or can share information that I wasn't aware of, I might say, "Oh, I'm certain that this group of people experiences life in this way," and someone from that group says, "That's not how we experience life, Trent." Then they reveal to me that I was wrong. And then that knowledge is unsettling, at least for a moment or maybe for a while, and then I can change my view. But that's the value of hearing that other perspective. Is it rearranges my understanding of a truth of a situation.
I love that because we're constantly trying to integrate more data into our perspective, but we live in a society that refuses to incorporate new data because it might challenge the perspective that they are committed to. And at that point, you're no longer a truth seeker. You're an ego. You're comfortable in your ego and asserting from that point of view. And for me, and I don't mean this to try and judge everyone, but for me, I'm not interested in listening to people who haven't had their egos get kicked in the stomach. Those are the people I'm interested in listening to. Those people who have walked through that crucible, who have had their truths completely challenged by the universe that they live in, and are finding that the world is bigger than their ego. Those are the people I'm listening to. And so this segues into what we're going to talk about. There's a word that is a branch of philosophy called epistemology. It just basically means, how do we know things? Episteme is Greek, is where we get like knowledge. Logos, like the study of like biology, is the study of life. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. How do we actually know things? What's happening there? So in essence, I studied this. I ran across this word when I was in like undergrad and graduate school. What do you know, Trent, about epistemology, and why do you think it matters?
Well, I would say formally I became acquainted with this term and this concept during seminary when I was at Fuller out in Pasadena, and I took a class, one of my favorite classes, called Faith and Reason. And in that class, we just kind of opened up Pandora's box of philosophy in an environment where it was open-minded, but people still had very strong faith commitments. It felt kind of like a dangerous task. And I remember the professor would like close the door and he'd be like, "I'm not saying anything that's wrong here, but he's like, maybe it's better if we just keep it in the classroom. What stays in this class, what happens in this classroom stays in this classroom."
Man, seminary class like Vegas, right?
Dude, it was a roll of the dice, man. But he opened up the box, and it was we had some very uncomfortable conversations because a lot of this was very unsettling for all of us who brought our own sort of confidence about what we knew. And I mean, we reached a point where we started talking about like the philosophy that you see like in the Matrix, where the people are coming to the realization that they might just exist for the sake of producing a battery. And the whole concept of like, are we just brains in a vat, and what we experience of the external world is just sort of a projection from in here? And it was deeply unsettling. I think it was a very healthy thing, but it took us way out to the rim. That was my formal introduction to epistemology. I mean, I think that I've been studying epistemology for several decades, just unknowingly, as I've been asking questions. Should I feel confident about that I know things, whether it's about religion or politics or sociology, whatever it is. So I've been curious naturally. I just can't help myself. So that's been a thing. And I think you asked what my exposure to epistemology and why does it matter? I think it matters, Joel, because there are a lot of things that we claim to know confidently, which we should be more humble / agnostic about. And there's a lot of things that we're agnostic about that we actually could be more certain of, where we take the easy way out when, in fact, if we would do the hard work intellectually, we could come to a place where we could say, I'm pretty sure that this is the case.
Yeah.
And dispense with some some of the humility when we know we can be confident. And then I would also add that there's that why else does it matter? There's the bumper sticker out there. This is sort of taking us to the far end of skepticism. There's that bumper sticker which says, question everything. You've seen that, question everything, which is actually absurd and self-defeating, because that would include questioning that.
Yeah.
The imperative to question. So yes, it's very, very important, and it's also important not to dispense with. We'll talk more about this, but not to dispense with certain foundational aspects of knowledge. So if you dispense with everything, then we can't even have a discussion. If we question that words can't really have any meaning, then we can't have a coherent discussion.
Yeah.
So I just think it's a very crucial question, especially in the times that we're living in, where big claims are being made. So what about you? What's your talk about where you learned about it and why you think it's important?
Well, first I want to respond to kind of what you were saying there in terms of it's so important because there are some things we shouldn't be doubting. That immediately made me think of the scene from Anchorman when Ron Burgundy is talking there with Christina Applegate's character, and they're talking about where the name San Diego came from, and he's like, I think it means a whale's vagina, and she's like, no, I'm pretty sure it means St. Diego, and she's like, and he's like, well, let's agree to disagree. And there are a lot of people who are agreeing to disagree about things that are just facts, and it's so bizarre to me. I'm just like, okay, what does it take to help that human being who believes nonsense based upon nonsense? How do we get that person to grow intellectually, or at least stop putting them in front of a camera and giving them megaphones and microphones? What do we do to move? And I don't know. As a society, we are pretty fucked right now. I don't know.
It's true. It's true. Yeah.
I came across this about 20 years ago in a book, a tiny little book that was actually written by a professor from Fuller Seminary, where his name is Paul Hebert. He's a missiologist, and this tiny little book he did, it was called the most boring title I've ever heard of: Missiological Implications and Epistemological Shifts. That's the name of the book. Missiological Implications and Epistemological Shifts. And I think the subtitle was Affirming Truth in a Modern Postmodern World. And he presents three different branches of epistemology that are kind of on the spectrum. On one end, you would have like positivism, which is like, I know the truth is very dogmatic, and we get a lot of that out of Western philosophy, this sense of like we discovered empiricism, and Francis Bacon showed us the scientific method. Now we just know things. But the truth is, data needs to be interpreted. Like, truth is objective, but we are subjects. And the moment we begin to work with data, that data becomes subjective based upon our interpretation. That's why there's a lot of like science has baked into it, a lot of like mitigating ways to try and make sure the bias of the scientist is not impacting the conclusion. On the other side of positivism was like idealism, or what's sometimes called instrumentalism. And that's very subjective. Like, all truth is subjective. And even the word tree can't mean anything. It's just a blah, blah, blah. It's a syllable being said in the air, and it means nothing. And we can draw whatever image to represent what you just said. Somewhere in the middle is what he's arguing for, which is often called critical realism. And that's to say, like, we can know some things and we can make sense of them, but we don't know all things. And what he did is he which I thought was fantastic, he showed like a black and white picture of like a baby's face, and it was all grayscale, and so you saw all the details of the lines of the face, and you saw like deep into what this image was. Oh, that's a baby's face. And then he showed like, just if you turn that image on like Microsoft Word into black and white, all of a sudden it changes. You lose all the nuance of gray. There's no gray nuance in there, but you can still see the black lines and go like, I'm pretty sure that's a baby's face. So what critical realism admits is I don't know everything, but for some things, if I have enough data, I can have a sense of certainty if I have enough data. So critical realism owns that I don't always have all the data. And so that was so fascinating to me. And, I'll transition to a question I have for you here. Another book I read I read it probably pretty early when I became a pastor, like 2010, 2011. And this book was written by another philosopher, theologian named James K.A. Smith. And it was called Desiring the Kingdom. And what he argues, it's kind of a book focusing on cultural anthropology. Fascinating book. Absolutely loved it. Changed the way I looked about and I thought about everything. But he criticizes the West's unconscious commitment to Rene Descartes, Cartesian thinking, his famous dictum, I think, therefore I am. Most people know that one. I think, therefore I am. And Smith argues that we're not fundamentally thinking creatures. That's what our whole education system is based on, that, as if we're all like boxes that you just put information into. That we have more information at our fingertips than ever in the history of the world, and it has not made us better people. So what if we're not thinking creatures, what are we? And he argues that we're desiring, or if we're not thinking beings, we're desiring creatures. We have desires, and those mess with our ability to think. And so we're not just floating brains, is what he's arguing. Our feelings, all our experiences, all these things are kind of weaving into this bowl of spaghetti of how we determine what's true and what is not true. So I just want to throw this over to you, Trent. What do you think about Descartes' quote? And do you see any different ways of knowing?
That's such a good question, man. Yes. So I think about Descartes' quote. I think it's captivating. I wouldn't say that I'm qualified to subvert it or attack it because there's a lot to it. But he was the Cartesian philosophy is known for the mind-body dualism, and so the sense that we, almost maybe a proto-Platonic thing, that we are essentially a mind that has a body. And I think I remember reading some of that book a little over 10 years ago, Desiring the Kingdom, and I remember that it made me ask the question, is our thinking subsidiary to like our desiring? Like, do we deploy our thinking and our rationality in service of our desires? Because there's nothing wrong with this approach, but I mean, I think that we ought to be as critical, as skeptical as we can be, and to engage our minds as much as possible. That does not change the fact that the rational project has not really infiltrated human society yet. And maybe until our sort of like prefrontal cortex, whatever, gets bigger, we're still going to be desiring sort of pre-rational creatures who sort of do rationality on the back end of things. And then I might also say I would problematize, how much I love that word, I would problematize the Descartes' statement by referring to somebody like Alan Watts, who would often talk about the useful fiction of the word or the concept of I. It's a useful fiction. But we experience the world in a lot of ways as individuals. But is there anything? Can we ascribe reality to the sense of I-ness? We are so interconnected interconnected to the room that I'm in. It's having effects on me that I couldn't compute. You and I having a conversation takes on it. There's a certain organism that results from you and I. And so there's so many different ways. You might say more about this with one of the theses that you came across, but there's so many ways in which we're so interconnected that even the question of who am I as an individual, and can I prove or disprove my own existence is maybe even somewhat beside the point if you step away from Cartesian logic. And then, so let me just say the things about knowing, and then you can come back at me about this. But yes, I think that there are different ways of knowing. I think that there there are divisions of knowledge. For instance, there's practical knowledge. You can know how to do something and have the competency for it. There is knowledge through experience. You gain knowledge of the world through your experience of the world. There is scientific knowledge, which is propositional, which involves making a statement that can be accepted or rejected, is capable of being refuted. So there are various ways of knowing, and that's probably not even scratching the surface. But
Nope.
making
No.
those distinctions and understanding them and bringing those distinctions to a conversation, I think would be very, very helpful in advancing the cultural project, because we don't do these things. We assume that other people are sharing assumptions when we make scientific claims or when we make claims from experience or whatever. And I think it makes things very muddled in conversations.
Yeah, I agree with what you're trying to say there in terms of the muddling that happens. And I one of the things that you kind of teed up for me there is different ways of knowing. And I saw this model, and I haven't dug deep into it, but it resonates with me. It's called extended epistemology. And what it's arguing for is there are multiple ways of knowing that all just kind of are interacting together. It kind of makes me think of like Wesley's quadrilateral, if you ever studied that theology, where John Wesley was saying, where there's scripture that's primary, then there's reason, tradition, and experience, the quadrilateral, where this is kind of talking about there are different ways of knowing. And what I loved about this perspective is it talks about the two things that tend to be most celebrated in our society, which is propositional knowing, which is this sense of theories and conclusions that we get to around trying to what we might say as foundational knowing. It's a sense of things that I experiment, I create. I think they call it generalized knowing. And then there's practical knowing that comes off of that, right? We have a theory of gravity, and we all began to just kind of like, oh, that's aligning with my experience. And that knowledge begins to gain more credibility, right? That's what's happening here in the public sphere. There's credibility towards knowledge. And what's hard for people is they slice out a ton of data so that they can keep the things that they want to be true as the truth. But really, it's just your truth because you have discarded tons of data because you don't like what it leads to. And so what they're arguing is there's other kinds of knowledge that at least our modern society don't lean into as well. One of them they call is foundational knowing. This is what they would say indigenous, ancestral kind of knowledge, this kind of the spiritual knowing that happens. And what I'm saying when I say spiritual, I don't mean religious. I'm not pointing to a religion because that tends to be more dogmatic in its views. And I'm not against dogma. All right. I want to say that when you and I say something, it operates like dogma. Right, I assert something that operates almost like dogma. But if the truth is that underneath all of our beliefs is an unsubstantiated belief that we choose not to doubt. Like for me, for example, I choose to believe that all human beings are worthy and have value. I can't prove that.
Right.
I choose to believe that because that foundation then I build upon helps me develop values and show up in the world in the way that I want to. And so this kind of foundational knowing are things that we gather as a species and have gathered and are kind of like in our genes, so to speak. And then there's artistic knowing, which is creating representations through story, visual art, movement, music, those kinds of things. I think I heard the Reformed pastor, Tim Keller, who believes in Calvin's God, even though I think his God is a dick, I like Tim Keller. I like what he says. And he says, I think he says, I love the truth, but I need art to help me understand it. And I love that little nuance there. There are multiple ways of knowing. So I think that's what we're kind of like getting at. And I just I read a book recently because I kind of work in the corporate world, and the corporate world's all about data. We're data informed. I'm just like,
Yes.
half of you don't even know what that means. It's like you don't
Yeah.
know how they got that data. You just care that the data is there to justify a decision. And that to me is
Yeah.
not productive. It's kind of lazy. Just because something is called data doesn't mean that the conclusion that we've come to based upon that data is just as reliable. So this book is called Calling Bullshit, and
Mm.
it's called The Art of Skepticism in a Data-Driven World. And basically, data by itself is neutral, but it takes human beings to interpret that data, and human beings are naturally biased. We have agendas. And that's why I think the spiritual path is becoming more aware of where my biases are, where my agendas are, because they're usually tied to unconscious, unhealed trauma that we've experienced when we're younger. And therefore, we're trying to create a world that feels safer rather than seek the truth. And so that's what I think tends to happen. And this book is so fantastic. It talks a
Mm.
lot about like, just because there's correlation doesn't mean there's causation, and it distinguishes those two. And they talk about just that data can be used to almost tell any story. I could take the same set of empirical data and tell multiple stories with it. It makes me think of a series that I'm now wrapping up called The Wheel of Time. It's a fantasy series. It's 14
Mm.
books, but in that series, there's this group called the Aes Sedai, and they're able to wield magic, but to gain um, credibility with the people, they take an oath off this magical oath rod that says they can never speak a lie. So everyone's supposed to trust them. But what they are
Mm.
actually really good at is manipulating the truth. And so there's a line in the book that says, an Aes Sedai never lies, but the truth she speaks may not be the truth you think you hear.
Mm.
And that is the world we live in, man.
Well, Joel, I would to follow along what you said about data. I mean, I think that there can be bad data in the sense that just because something is a study doesn't mean that it's a good study or that there are
Yep.
any takeaways from that study. Someone can study, you know, anteaters and do their studies poorly and learn nothing, and whatever they gain is totally useless. And so we need more and more, I think, we need better understanding as a society about what constitutes good studies, because there's so many people who want to weaponize. Back in the COVID days, it was the follow the science, and they were trying to weaponize studies. Oh, this
Yeah.
study, that study, and it's like, just because you can call something a study doesn't mean that it has proven
Yeah.
to be conclusive. Tell me more about the study.
Yeah.
Was it done under conditions that can actually isolate a cause and effect? And like you said, it's so funny, as a little aside, so many people, when they're quoting a data set, they will say, well, we all know that correlation doesn't prove causation, but, and then what follows is, you should still basically more or less believe that my correlation is causation. It's like,
Yep.
no, you don't accept it when it comes from somebody that you disagree with. You don't get to show causation or suggest causation when it's not called for. Now, you might say something like, we have a study that shows very, very strong correlation. It's not explainable by any other method. It's suggestive that further study is warranted and maybe even points in a certain direction, but we can't say that X causes Y as a result of
Yeah.
this study. We simply can't do that. And this brings us back to that point of epistemological humility, is know
Yep.
where your knowledge ends and where it can take you. And if it can't take you to a certain place, don't be dogmatic about it. Just simply say that this suggests that this might be the case.
That kind of approach is so attractive to me. For me, as I've grown in knowledge, and knowledge has created more humility for me, because the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. The problem is that approach is very unmarketable. We live in a
Yes, that's
world
exactly right. Yes.
We live in a world that wants to be fed lies. They want it. They would never tell you that, but they're eating it all day long. And what do I do to combat that? It's been a conversation with my wife and I. What do we do to create like a compassionate and effective way to help people wake up? And I don't mean, when I say wake up, I'm not using the word woke. So whoever's saying that, whoever thinks that, I'm not trying to correlate to that. What I'm trying to do is like, we are all preconditioned to believe things that aren't true. That's just, accept that about yourself as a human being. And it's painful, like you've said, learning things that are uncomfortable, being unsettled. And slowly over time, what it's helped me do is embrace my instinct of skepticism. So, Trent, here's my question to you. What is your relationship with skepticism, and why is that important to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my relationship with this is I just don't know really any other way to live. I mean, I think I was one of those kids who annoyingly asked my parents so many questions, and it was just like, Trent, please stop. But I've just always been a fairly curious person, so that's just been a way of life. And I remember I took AP psychology when I was in high school, and I'll never forget in the introduction to this textbook that we read, the author was advocating for a disposition of learning that he called open-minded skepticism, and I just loved that. It means you're going to ask hard questions, but you're also going to be open. There's that skepticism that's always closing off possibilities and always never content with a sort of a satisfactory answer. No, you should question things, but be open to seeing, now that's actually true. This person has been right. And I would also say, why is skepticism important to me? This is very practical because people want to persuade us to do one thing or another. And that's based upon that persuasion is based upon what they claim to know. And so the stakes can be really quite high. I think skepticism becomes a very urgent task in this kind of environment. If somebody is just, let me just use going back to sort of like the Bible. People will want other human beings to behave. I can take the topic of homosexuality. People want society to believe that homosexuality is a sin, that it is a perversion of sexuality, that it is unnatural, and their claims are based upon the teachings largely of a dude who probably lived in the latter part of the first century named Paul. Now, did Paul have divine information? Was he just spouting things that he thought were true? We don't know. But we are right to ask hard questions about this because there are people who want to legislate about this issue based upon what they think the Bible teaches that it's true. And so we need to have a disposition of skepticism when people are claiming that things are true and they want you to behave in a different way and they want society to behave in a different way. I think we are duty bound to embrace skepticism for many other reasons, but that to me is the biggest reason. Is there are people who want power over other human beings in this life, and that power over other people is based upon claims of knowledge that need to be critiqued.
I love that. Oh, bro, that's a soundbite right there. I love that. That's a soundbite. Yeah, I immediately start, when you're saying that, thinking about all the people who use the Bible in such ways, and that's why you and I have done podcasts on inerrancy, because most people don't really look under the hood of their beliefs. They don't know why they believe anything because they're scared shitless to realize that they've been wrong their whole life. But I would just offer some compassion here. It's like, most people don't believe the things they believe because they've studied them. They believe the things they believe because they were given them.
Right.
And so,
that's right.
No need to beat yourself up. No need to think your parents or your pastor or your faith leader or whoever, your Sunday school teacher, were idiots. That's not what I'm I'm advocating for. What I'm advocating for is to shift from truth that you've been given to truth that you seek.
Mm-hmm.
And you need tools to do that. And the
That's right.
tools are going to be hard earned. You're going to have to develop some grit. You're going to have to develop some like unction and care about the truth. Most people who claim to care about the truth haven't thought an iota about why they believe what they believe. And it's so annoying to have conversation. As a pastor, I sat across the table, drinking coffee, talked with so many people telling me their stories, and the amount of times I just had to like bite my tongue just because I knew I'd heard the story 100 times of just someone who hadn't really developed the intellectual chops yet to question what they were given. And it's scary. It's hard. I have compassion for those people. I went through that process. It feels like you're dying when you're letting go of the beliefs that you were given as a child. It feels like you're dying. So that's why most people don't do it. They're scared of it. They're scared of the process. They're scared of really investigating. And occasionally we have that one kid like you in high school, Trent. I'm sure you were the guy who was just like questioning things. And we all think, oh man, that girl, she's, they're an outsider. And people feel comfort in being in the in crowd and everyone else being evil and against us. And we live in a society that has two gigantic buckets like that. It's like we live in a gigantic high school lunchroom, but there's only two cliques. And I'm so tired of it. I want to call us as human beings to like step out of the cliques, question the things that you claim to believe. Ask yourself. I genuinely trust. I don't need people to agree with me. I just want people to explore and to be braver with their conclusions by actually testing them and questioning them. Where does this come from? So I went on that tangent because I think inerrancy is stupid, and it's the problem behind most Christian beliefs, because we believe this old book is inerrant, which is also an unbiblical idea. The Bible does not claim to be inerrant. It doesn't.
Absolutely. And I would simply suggest both to people who are listening / watching us who are Christian or just part of Western culture, which is probably 99% of people who are listening and watching, that if you want to look to a historical character who helped to usher in the age in which we can ask a lot of these difficult questions, it's none other than Martin Luther, who, has a very checkered story. But when he confronted the Catholic Church, he did so because at some level, he believed in the project of skepticism, that he was not simply going to take the Catholic Church's bullshit and bullshit explanations. He wasn't going to simply accept what they had to teach. He was a thinking person. He believed that God had given him the power of critical thinking, and he used that. And we have inherited that tradition of challenging those who claim a monopoly on truth. And I would simply say, if you're especially if you're a Christian out there and you're part of that inerrantist tradition, you also have you have inherited the legacy of Martin Luther, who used his mind to critique things, particularly when his body probably told him, his intuition told him, there's something wrong here. Don't stop that. I think, Joel, you and I are both saying, continue that tradition,
please,
of asking those hard questions, not rejecting things just because they're tradition, but being willing to ask the hard questions. Is what I've always believed the truth? Hey, very well may be, but it also may not be. And I would say to people the legacy of the Protestant Reformation has goods and bads, but you have to be willing to ante up and take the risk of learning. It may disrupt your life. Just true story. It may when I left the church, it disrupted my life in a lot of ways. It was hard, but it's also been this great adventure in other ways. If you want that, if you value that kind of experience, I would say go forward. If you don't value that experience, then don't go forward. But please, at least for my sake, be willing to go forward, because I don't want to personally. I'd rather encounter more people who are pursuing truth at the risk of discomfort, rather than live in a world and society where people are content just to accept what they're told.
Yep. Yep. And there are high stakes, as you've said before.
Yeah.
By just accepting what you're told and not developing and cultivating critical thinking skills, people get hurt. Like, people get hurt by people in power, because people in power, especially you look at our society, like whatever politician, whatever side of the cafeteria in the high school you're sitting on, the leader is a narcissist. You don't get to that level without being kind of a narcissist.
That's right.
And they know how to manipulate you. The only way to mitigate that and challenge that is for you to develop skills to go like, but is that true? And by that, I'll know you are developing that skill when you begin to question something you believed a year ago.
Yes.
If you have not questioned something you believe a year ago, you don't have the skills yet. And if you don't have the skills, then you're a lemming. I'm sorry, you're just following a crowd.
That's right.
And there's a cliff that you just might run off at any given point in time. God bless you. I think you're still a valuable, beautiful person. I believe that. But you don't have critical thinking skills, and your truth is not something that's interesting to me. I'm interested in people who pursue truth at the cost of their own comfort. So, Trent, I want to end with a question for you. Any final thoughts on the importance of seeking the truth beyond my truth?
Well, I think that, again, what just to reinforce what we've been saying, I just think that what you and I are recommending to people, we are proposing a way of life, a disposition of being human that we value. And we could do a whole other podcast on why we value those things. But we are commending that to you as an experience that will not be easy. I mean, you could stop right now and not go forward, and you might know the ignorance is bliss experience. It might be better. But I commend it to anybody seeking an adventurous life. And then I, again, go back to, I commend it for the sake of society, because I think that we are better in a world where people are asking hard questions and not accepting the party line. If you are, whether you sort of are a Democrat or Republican or liberal or conservative, if you accept there were a list of 10 talking points that are sort of the boxes you have to check to be a true liberal or true conservative, you accept all of those, there's a very, very strong possibility that you're not doing your own thinking and that you're just regurgitating a party line. It could be any party's line. And that's I would say, I would urge you not to want that. That's what I would wrap up with.
I love that. Yeah, I was inspired by entire movements of Republicans who were supporting Harris, because to me, that's interesting. They probably have up 1,000 different views than me, but I applaud that they're like, they still hold to their policies that are different than me, but they're doing so in a way that to me is brave, and to me is going like, hey, I'm not going to just go black or white. I'm going to seek the gradient in between there and find where my beliefs like express authentically. Trent, thank you so much, man, for your exhortations there.
I went very pastoral, man. Yeah, dude, I went very pastoral, man. But that was good.
I love being pastored by atheists.
There is precedent, aka Samaritans.
Oh, I love it. Yeah. All right, friends. All right. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. We're grateful that you're joining us. Please come check out our website, www.leadballoons.com. pod.com, or you can email us at leadballoonspodcast@gmail.com. And we'd love to hear from you. Topics that you would love for Trent and I to just noodle on, talk about. We would love that. You can also check us out on YouTube, Spotify, all the various platforms. And we would love to hear from you guys.
Big time.